Picture a place hidden from the world, where every whispered word was a shield, every sentence a barricade. Deep in the medieval countryside, a village did something extraordinary. They created a language unlike any other, not to connect with the outside world, but to lock it out entirely. This wasn't just a dialect or an accent. It was a linguistic code so precise, so deliberate, that only those born within the village borders could ever hope to understand it. Why would an entire community go to such lengths? What were they protecting that demanded such secrecy? The answer lies in a story of survival, identity, and the unbreakable bond between language and culture. Think about the power of words, how they can build bridges or burn them down. Now imagine a language designed to do neither, but instead to act as an invisible wall. For centuries, this village thrived in isolation, its people speaking a tongue that baffled travelers, merchants, and even scholars. To outsiders, it sounded like nonsense, a jumble of sounds without meaning. But to the villagers, it was the heartbeat of their community, a living cipher that kept their traditions safe from prying eyes. This wasn't just about keeping secrets. It was about preserving a way of life in a world that constantly sought to erase it. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of history to uncover the story of this linguistic fortress. How did such a language come to be? Who crafted its rules? And how did it survive when so many other medieval mysteries have faded away? From the whispers of the past to the echoes still heard in modern linguistics, this tale is a testament to human creativity and resilience. It's a reminder that language isn't just a tool for communication. It can be a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a lifeline. So let's begin this journey into a world where words held the power to protect, and where silence wasn't just golden, it was sacred. The story of this village begins with desperation, a group of people pushed to the edge, seeking shelter not just in the wilderness but in the very structure of language itself. Hidden among rugged peaks or swallowed by ancient forests, the village location wasn't just remote, it was a fortress of geography. Every steep path, every tangled thicket acted as a natural barrier, but the founders knew physical isolation wasn't enough. In a world where outsiders could arrive uninvited, carrying new laws, new gods, or new threats, they needed something far more subtle and unbreakable, a way to make their thoughts untouchable. Historical fragments suggest these villagers weren't just hiding, they were rebels of a kind. Perhaps they were heretics fleeing the wrath of a king, or families escaping a war that had consumed their homeland. What's clear is that they arrived with a shared resolve to build a world where no outsider could ever infiltrate their trust, and so they turned language into their ultimate weapon. Imagine the moment when the first elder stood before the community and proposed the unthinkable, to dismantle the words they'd known since childhood and rebuild them into something only they could decipher. It wasn't just about changing a few phrases, it was about inventing an entire system of sounds and meanings from scratch, designed to confuse, to exclude, to protect. The genius of their plan lay in its simplicity. Unlike complex codes or ciphers which could be cracked with time, their language grew organically, passed from parent to child like a secret handshake stretched across generations. Children learned it not as a second tongue, but as their mother tongue, the only way they'd ever known how to speak. Outsiders who stumbled upon the village might hear conversations flowing like water, but to them, it was noise without rhythm, words without meaning. And because the language had no written form, there were no documents to steal, no dictionaries to decode. It lived only in the air between them, in the quiet moments at hearthsides, in the laughter of children who'd never need to fear a stranger understanding their whispers. But maintaining such secrecy required more than linguistic cunning. It demanded absolute unity. The village became a clockwork of silence. Outsiders were met with polite but vacant stares, their questions answered with shrugs or feigned confusion. Traders who passed through might leave with baskets of goods, but never with a single usable word. Over time, legends spread of the place where speech itself was a locked door, and curiosity turned to wary respect. The villagers didn't just speak differently, they taught the world to leave them alone, and in doing so, they proved something remarkable. That language isn't just a way to share ideas, it can also be the ultimate declaration of who belongs and who never will. Building a language from nothing is no small feat. It takes more than just making up words. The villagers didn't just tweak their existing speech, they rebuilt it from the ground up, brick by linguistic brick. Imagine sitting down to create an entire system of communication, one where every word, every grammatical rule, even the way sounds were formed, had to be carefully chosen not for clarity, but for obscurity. This wasn't about poetry or artistry, it was about survival. Every syllable was a calculated move in a centuries-long game of cultural defense. Linguists who have studied similar secret languages suggest the villagers likely started with their native tongue, then twisted it beyond recognition. Common words might have been reversed, like saying bread as derb, or spliced with entirely new sounds. Verbs could have followed irregular patterns, refusing to conjugate in ways outsiders would expect. Even the rhythm of speech might have been altered, with pauses in unexpected places or melodies in the tone that made it sound almost musical, but only to those who knew the key. Some experts believe they borrowed elements from forgotten dialects, or even the sounds of nature bird calls, wind through trees woven into human speech to create something utterly unique. But the real brilliance lay in how the language evolved. Unlike formal codes, which can be cracked if someone discovers the key, this language lived and breathed with its speakers. New words were added over time, old ones shifted meaning, and children grew up absorbing these changes without realizing they were part of a grand design. There were no textbooks, no written rules, just a living, shifting web of sounds that outsiders could never pin down. A merchant might think he'd learned a few phrases, only to return a year later and find the same words now meant something entirely different. Maintaining this secrecy required more than linguistic creativity, it demanded discipline. The village became a society of silent strategists, where every conversation in the presence of outsiders was a performance. A farmer might casually mention the weather, but in the secret language, those same words could be warning neighbors about approaching soldiers. Children were taught from their first words to switch effortlessly into the local tongue when strangers were near, while answering in gibberish or feigning ignorance if questioned directly. The language wasn't just spoken, it was guarded, cherished, and weaponized when necessary. What's astonishing isn't just that they created this linguistic fortress, but that it worked for generations. In an era when entire cultures were swallowed by conquest or assimilation, this village held its ground without lifting a sword. Their walls weren't made of stone, but of something far more durable, the unbreakable bond between sound and meaning, known only to those who belonged. And in that bond lay a powerful truth, that sometimes the strongest armor isn't forged from steel, but from the sheer, defiant power of human speech. To understand why a village would go to such extraordinary lengths, we have to step into their world, a world where every stranger could be a threat, where a single overheard conversation might mean the difference between freedom and subjugation. This wasn't just about keeping secrets, it was about survival in its purest form. Picture a time when kingdoms rose and fell at the edge of a sword, when entire cultures vanished under the boots of conquerors. For these villagers, their language became more than communication. It was their first and last line of defense. Think of how easily information spreads today, how quickly words travel. Now imagine the opposite, a community where speech itself was a filter, letting only the trusted in while keeping everyone else at arm's length. Raiders might storm the gates, but without understanding the language, they'd never grasp the villagers' plans, their hiding places, their warnings whispered from house to house. Traders might haggle over goods, but the true meaning behind every negotiation remained locked away, ensuring no outsider could manipulate or exploit them. Even religious or political persecutors would find themselves stumbling in the dark, unable to root out dissent when every conversation was a mystery. But the brilliance of this linguistic shield wasn't just in what it kept out, it was in what it held together. Language is the glue of identity, the thread that weaves a community into something greater than the sum of its parts. For these villagers, every shared word reinforced their bond, reminding them that they weren't just neighbors but allies in an unspoken pact. Children grew up knowing their speech marked them as part of something singular, something worth protecting. In a world that often demanded conformity, their language was a daily act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to disappear. Yet every fortress, no matter how strong, casts a shadow. The very thing that protected the village also isolated it. Marriages outside the community became rare, as few could bridge the language gap. New ideas, technologies, or innovations from beyond the mountains might never penetrate the linguistic barrier. And when disease or famine struck, the villagers couldn't easily call for help from neighbors they'd spent generations keeping at a distance. Their language, designed to preserve, also imprisoned, cutting them off from the very alliances that might have secured their future. The cost of secrecy was a double-edged sword. It kept them safe, yes, but it also meant their stories, their history, their innovations rarely traveled beyond the valley. While other cultures exchanged knowledge, grew, and adapted, the villagers remained suspended in time, their greatest strength also their greatest limitation. And so their language became more than a tool, it became a mirror, reflecting both their unyielding resilience and the price of living behind walls built of words. At first glance, the village's secret language might have sounded like nonsense, a chaotic jumble of sounds with no apparent logic. But beneath the surface lay a meticulously crafted system, designed to be just familiar enough to feel natural to its speakers, yet utterly impenetrable to outsiders. Unlike the slow, organic evolution of most languages, this one was deliberately engineered for confusion, like a castle built with staircases leading nowhere and doors that opened into walls. Take something as simple as naming everyday objects. In most languages, words for common items like water or bread tend to be short, easy to pronounce, and rooted in practicality. But in this village, a loaf of bread might be called something like talamir, a word with no obvious connection to its meaning. Even more disorienting, the term for water could shift subtly depending on who was listening. One word among trusted neighbors, another entirely when outsiders were near. Verbs were another layer of deception. Where most languages follow predictable patterns, I walk, you walk, they walk, here, conjugations might twist unpredictably, or verbs could change entirely based on the time of day or the speaker's mood. The structure of the language wasn't just random, it was strategic. Linguists who have studied similar constructed tongues suggest the villagers likely borrowed techniques from cipher makers, warping their native speech in ways that felt intuitive to them but alien to everyone else. Syllables might be reversed, so river became revere, or spliced with entirely new sounds, turning house into hauschka. Some words may have even been borrowed from older, forgotten dialects or inspired by the natural world, like using bird calls or the sound of wind through trees as phonetic building blocks. The result was a language that flowed naturally for those raised in it but sounded like broken fragments to anyone else. Teaching this language to children was the linchpin of its survival. From their very first words, village children learned to speak in this coded tongue, absorbing its rhythms and rules as effortlessly as any child learns their mother tongue. There were no grammar books or vocabulary lists, just a lifetime of immersion, where the secret language was the only way to fully express oneself. Outsiders who married into the community faced a steep uphill climb, often never achieving true fluency, forever marked as outsiders by their stilted speech. Yet for all its deliberate chaos, the language wasn't lawless. It had its own internal logic, its own hidden patterns, rules known only to the villagers. Certain sounds might always appear at the start of words for tools, while names for animals could share a subtle tonal signature. These weren't rules written down but absorbed through generations, a kind of linguistic DNA passed from parent to child. The genius of it was that even if an outsider painstakingly learned a handful of words, the system was designed to shift just enough over time, like a river changing its course, that any outsider's knowledge would soon be obsolete. In daily life, this language was more than just speech. It was a living, breathing shield. A farmer bargaining with a trader might use one word for price when speaking to him, then switch to the secret term when turning to his wife, signaling his true thoughts. Children playing in the square could shout warnings to each other under the guise of nonsense rhymes. Even in moments of danger, the language became a tool of last resort, a way to coordinate without alerting the very threats they feared. What's remarkable is how fluidly the villagers navigated this duality. To them, it wasn't a code to crack, but the natural order of things, as instinctive as breathing. The language didn't just hide their thoughts, it shaped their very identity, binding them together in a shared secret that no outsider could ever fully penetrate. And in that shared secret lay their power, the power to remain, against all odds, unmistakably and unshakably themselves. The elders weren't just respected voices in the village, they were the living architects of its linguistic fortress. Their role went beyond mere tradition. They were the gatekeepers of sound and meaning, the ones who decided which words lived, which ones changed, and which ones vanished forever. Every syllable spoken in the village had their fingerprints on it, shaped by their collective memory and their unyielding commitment to secrecy. When a child mispronounced a word or a trader overheard a guarded conversation, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a crack in the walls, and the elders were there to seal it before the outside world could seep in. One of their most powerful tools was control over the language's evolution. Unlike natural languages, which shift slowly over generations, this one was meticulously curated. The elders gathered in hushed meetings, debating which words needed alteration. Perhaps a term used in trade had been overheard too often, or a phrase had started to resemble a neighboring dialect too closely. Then, like linguistic alchemists, they'd twist it into something new, ensuring outsiders could never rely on what they'd learned before. New words were introduced with deliberate obscurity, often tied to inside jokes, local landmarks, or events only villagers would understand. A term for grain might suddenly reference an old harvest festival, making it meaningless to anyone who hadn't lived through that season. But the elders' authority wasn't just creative, it was fiercely protective. Breaking the language rules carried serious consequences. A villager caught speaking an outside tongue within earshot of strangers might face days of silence, forbidden to speak even to their own family until the elders deemed them penitent. Repeat offenders could be excluded from important gatherings, denied roles in trade negotiations, or, in extreme cases, ostracized entirely. The message was clear: the language wasn't just a way to speak, it was a vow of loyalty, and betrayal of that vow threatened everyone. Yet the elders' greatest challenge wasn't punishing carelessness. It was preventing the language from seeping beyond the village borders. Marriages to outsiders were rare but not unheard of, and each one was a potential breach. Brides or grooms from other villages faced grueling language tests before being accepted, and even then, they were never fully trusted with certain phrases, especially those tied to the community's deepest secrets. Traveling traders were met with a carefully rehearsed performance. Villagers would switch to broken versions of regional dialects, feigning ignorance or stupidity to avoid revealing their true speech. The paradox of the elders' power was that while they preserved the language, they also held the village in a kind of suspended animation. Their control kept the community safe, but it also stifled dissent. Younger generations, curious about the world beyond the valley, sometimes chafed under the weight of so many rules. Rumors suggest that a handful of rebels deliberately taught fragments of the language to outsiders, not enough to break its secrecy, but just enough to trade for books, tools, or news from distant lands. The elders, of course, saw this as treason, and their punishments grew harsher as the world outside crept closer. In the end, the elders' legacy was one of both triumph and tension. They succeeded in guarding a linguistic treasure no invader could plunder, but at the cost of absolute control. Their names may be lost to history, but their influence lingers in every word spoken, and every word deliberately left unspoken by those who came after. They proved that language isn't just something we use, it's something we defend, sometimes at a price steeper than we ever intended to pay. Mourning in the village marketplace was a symphony of coded exchanges, a dance of words as intricate as the woven baskets lining the stalls. A fishmonger might call out what sounded like nonsense to passing traders, but to the villagers, it was a precise announcement of the day's catch, laced with inside jokes about the fishermen who'd hauled it in. Bargains were struck with layered meanings. A request for 3 measures of blue grain could mean wheat at a fair price, while 2 measures of red signaled a warning that the buyer was untrustworthy. Even children playing between the stalls absorbed these nuances, their games peppered with phrases that doubled as practice for the linguistic vigilance they'd need as adults. This language wasn't just a tool, it was the lens through which the village saw the world. Proverbs woven into everyday speech reinforced values. A phrase meaning, "quick hands make light work," also carried the unspoken rule against sharing tools with outsiders. Historical events lived on in vocabulary. The word for storm might echo an ancient flood that nearly destroyed the village, a story every child knew without needing to be told. The language bound them together so tightly that even their dreams were likely steeped in its rhythms, their subconscious thoughts shaped by its peculiar cadences. Yet this closeness came at a cost. Neighboring villages viewed them with a mix of awe and suspicion, trading with them out of necessity but never truly trusting them. The barrier wasn't just linguistic, it was cultural. While other communities exchanged folktales and intermarried, this village remained an island, their celebrations unintelligible to outsiders, their griefs private. Trade goods passed over the borders, but ideas rarely did. A neighboring potter might admire the village's distinctive ceramics, but without shared language, the techniques behind them remained a mystery. Remarkably, commerce found a way. The villagers developed a crude but effective pidgin for trade, blending gestures, broken fragments of regional dialects, and a handful of deliberately misleading words from their secret language. A merchant might leave thinking he'd gotten the better end of a deal, only to discover later that the fine wool he'd purchased was actually coarse yarn dyed to deceive. Essential goods like salt, iron, and medicinal herbs flowed in. but always through layers of negotiation so thick with misdirection that both sides knew they were being played, yet the game persisted because everyone needed what the other had. Children were the silent observers of this delicate dance. From the time they could toddle, they learned to switch effortlessly between the village tongue and the trade pidgin, their young minds absorbing the unspoken lesson. Some words were treasures to hoard, others were decoys to spend freely. By adolescence, they could haggle with a straight face, their innocent features masking calculations honed over generations. A teenage girl might chatter openly about the weather in the secret language, while her hands discreetly signaled to her brother that the trader's scales were rigged. Festivals were where the language's dual nature shone brightest. To outsiders invited for rare celebrations, the songs sounded merry but meaningless. But to the villagers, every lyric was an inside joke, a historical reference, or a veiled commentary on the guests themselves. A seemingly cheerful tune about the fox in the barley might actually mock a neighboring lord's failed raid decades earlier, while a dance that appeared ceremonial could map out escape routes through the surrounding hills. The outsiders clapped along, oblivious, while the villagers exchanged knowing smiles over their shoulders. The paradox was this: the very language that protected them also marked them as perpetual strangers. Neighbors traded with them but never invited them to weddings. Traveling minstrels skipped their village, knowing their songs would fall on deaf ears. Over time, the isolation bred legends, whispers that the villagers were witches, or descendants of a lost kingdom, or guardians of some ancient secret. The truth was simpler and perhaps sadder. They were just people who'd chosen walls of words over walls of stone, and in doing so, discovered that some barricades keep out light as well as danger. But in quiet moments, when no outsiders were near, the language became something tender. Lullabies crooned to infants carried the weight of generations. Elders told stories where every turn of phrase was a shared heirloom. Lovers devised private idioms within the already private tongue, layering intimacy upon intimacy. The language wasn't just a shield, it was a living thing, breathing between them, growing and changing in ways no outsider could ever trace. And that, perhaps, was the greatest secret of all. That exclusion could breed not just secrecy, but a kind of closeness so deep it defied translation. To the outside world, the village's secret language was like a locked chest in plain sight, fascinating precisely because it couldn't be opened. Travelers swapping stories at regional markets would embellish tales of the tongue-twisted folk, spinning yarns about curses or divine gifts to explain the inexplicable. Some neighbors dismissed it as harmless oddity, the way one might humor a peculiar relative, but others bristled at the exclusion, interpreting the linguistic barrier as arrogance or worse, a sign the villagers had something terrible to hide. Whispers spread of stolen goods hidden behind coded conversations, or secret pagan rites conducted in the garbled speech. The truth, of course, was far simpler and far more profound. It wasn't about malice but survival. Merchants faced the most practical frustrations. A trader accustomed to charming his way into better deals found himself floundering when compliments and banter fell on deliberately blank stares. Bargaining became a pantomime, pointing at goods, holding up fingers for prices, while the villagers exchanged glances laden with meanings he couldn't decipher. Clever merchants learned to watch hands rather than listen to words, noticing how a weaver's fingers might flick subtly toward a hidden stash of superior fabric when satisfied with an offer. Yet even these small victories were temporary. Return the next season, and the gestures had changed, the signals reshuffled like a deck of cards in a perpetual magic trick. A handful of outsiders became obsessed with cracking the code. One persistent scribe reportedly lived at the village edge for a year, scribbling phonetic approximations of overheard conversations in a tattered notebook. The villagers, amused at first, began feeding him deliberate nonsense using the word for rotten fish when he asked for hello, or teaching him elaborate insults disguised as endearments. When he finally attempted to proudly greet the elders with what he believed was a formal blessing, the eruption of stifled laughter told him all he needed to know. His notebook was burned in frustration that evening, the ashes scattered in a field where village children would later discover them and giggle at the memory. More threatening attempts came from authorities. A local bailiff, convinced the language concealed tax evasion, ordered a priest to learn it under the guise of spiritual outreach. The villagers welcomed the man, then spoke exclusively of crops and weather in his presence, reserving true conversations for moonless nights in cellars. After 6 months of pious patience, the priest reported back that the language was mere peasant babble, a verdict that likely saved the village from further scrutiny. Only one account suggests someone came close to true fluency. A wounded soldier taken in during a harsh winter was nursed by a village widow. Whether out of loneliness or gratitude, she began teaching him slowly, carefully, like unfolding a map one corner at a time. By spring, he could barter at the market without drawing suspicion, even catching sarcastic asides between teenagers. But when he tried to share this knowledge with his regiment, the words evaporated on his tongue like morning mist. Some claimed the language had a way of clinging only to those who respected its purpose. Others said the widow had been far more selective in her lessons than the soldier realized. Either way, the village secret remained intact, its walls unbreached. The real testament to their linguistic defiance wasn't in the failures of outsiders, but in their reactions. Over time, neighboring communities stopped trying to understand and instead wove the village into their own folklore. To some, they became trickster figures, clever foxes in human form. To others, they were tragic ghosts, forever separated from the living by an invisible curtain of sound. But perhaps the most telling response was the grudging respect that settled over the region. However much the language infuriated or bewildered, it commanded a certain awe. These people had done what kingdoms could not. They'd forged a border no army could cross, a sovereignty built not on land or law, but on the unassailable territory of the spoken word. Attempts to decode the village language became something of a scholarly obsession, a puzzle that lured linguists like moths to a flame. One early scholar, a monk named Brother Anselm, spent years meticulously documenting every syllable he overheard during seasonal trading visits. His notebooks, discovered centuries later, reveal a man teetering between fascination and frustration. He'd jot down phrases like Kelesh Navora, convinced it meant good harvest, only to realize months later the same words were used when discussing a sick child. The villagers, aware of his eavesdropping, had deliberately recycled phrases for entirely unrelated concepts, turning his painstaking lists into a labyrinth of false leads. More systematic efforts fared no better. In the 17th century, a nobleman with a passion for cryptography dispatched a team of scribes to live near the village, tasked with creating the first written lexicon of the language. The villagers, sensing the threat, played along, but with a twist. They'd point to a cow and say Tirish, then whisper Molag to one another with suppressed laughter. By week's end, the scribes had filled pages with contradictions, never realizing they'd been fed a diet of inside jokes and shifting synonyms. The nobleman's eventual dictionary was a masterpiece of confusion, its entries so hopelessly scrambled that later researchers mistook it for satire. Even military strategists tried and failed to weaponize the language's secrets. During a regional conflict, scouts reported that the village couriers could pass battle plans right under enemy noses, their conversations indistinguishable from idle chatter. A general commissioned a captured villager to teach his spies, offering gold and land in exchange. The villager, though, proved creatively uncooperative. He taught the spies elaborate greetings for imaginary holidays or lengthy ballads about fictional goats, while his own people, listening from the shadows, updated their speech to render his lessons obsolete. By the time the spies attempted their first mission, the words they'd learned were already relics, and their clumsy attempts at fluency marked them instantly as imposters. The language's greatest defense, though, wasn't just its complexity, it was the villagers' collective resolve. Children learned early to spot outsiders feigning ignorance and would innocently correct their speech with deliberate mistakes. Elders held nightly meetings to discuss which words needed retiring, like generals rotating passwords. Even the village dogs seemed complicit, barking at strangers who lingered too long near private conversations. This wasn't just secrecy, it was a culture of vigilance where every citizen became a guardian of the linguistic flame. Perhaps the most poignant attempt came from a young linguist in the 19th century, who arrived with a radical theory that the language wasn't invented but inherited, a relic of some lost civilization. She lived among the villagers for 2 years, earning rare trust by healing the sick with herbal remedies. Slowly, they began sharing fragments of stories, songs, even a whispered creation myth. But just as her notebooks filled with breakthroughs, she fell gravely ill. On her deathbed, she begged for the words to be preserved, but the villagers gently refused. Their language wasn't hers to take, no matter how kindly she'd asked. The notebooks vanished afterward, rumored buried with her, a final act of guardianship by the very people who'd let her in just enough to understand what she could never truly possess. What all these attempts shared was a fundamental miscalculation. Outsiders assumed the language was a code to crack, a locked door waiting for the right key. But to the villagers, it was something far more profound, a living thread connecting them to their past and to one another. No amount of scholarship could decode that. The language didn't just hide their words, it guarded their memories, their jokes, their grief, and in a world that constantly demanded they surrender their ways, it remained the one thing no outsider could ever take. The villagers' secret language wasn't just words, it was the living pulse of their culture, the rhythm by which they measured their days and preserved their past. Every proverb carried the weight of generations, distilled wisdom wrapped in sounds outsiders couldn't unravel. A simple saying like, "The owl hunts in silence," might sound like mundane advice about patience to an eavesdropper, but to the villagers, it referenced an ancient tale of resistance, how their ancestors had outwitted tax collectors by pretending ignorance under interrogation, as silent and watchful as night birds. These weren't just phrases, they were time capsules, preserving victories and warnings in syllables only the initiated could unpack. Music became another layer of this cultural armor. Work songs sung during harvests encoded planting techniques within their melodies, ensuring agricultural knowledge survived even if written records were lost. Lullabies hummed to infants contained hidden histories, the rise and fall of seasons, the names of forgotten heroes, even the locations of hidden springs in times of drought. To outsiders, these tunes seemed simple folk melodies, but to the villagers, they were living libraries, their verses shifting slightly with each generation to reflect new lessons while keeping old truths intact. The most sacred songs were reserved for solstices, their lyrics so densely packed with meaning that elders would spend entire winters deciphering them for the young, ensuring not a single metaphor was lost. Oral traditions took on near-mythic importance. Without written records, the village history lived in the spoken word, in epic poems recited at gatherings, where a single misplaced syllable could alter the meaning of entire passages. Storytellers trained for decades to master these narratives, their performances punctuated by audience responses that verified their accuracy. A collective gasp at a particular turn of phrase confirmed the teller had correctly included the detail about the drought of 723. Laughter at an obscure joke proved they'd preserved the proper intonation from 3 generations back. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was communal memory, performed and polished like a gem passed hand to hand through centuries. Even their humor became a fortress. Puns and wordplay flourished in the secret language, their meanings hinging on double entendres no outsider could grasp. A joke about the baker's thin loaves might seem like commentary on bread, but actually mocked a long-dead tax collector's failed census attempt. Children learned early that laughter could be a weapon. They'd giggle at traders' mispronunciations, then rush home to recount the blunders with perfect mimicry, reinforcing both their linguistic mastery and their separation from the world beyond. The very structure of their humor taught that some things could never be shared, that true understanding was the birthright of the village alone. Rituals solidified this bond. Coming-of-age ceremonies required adolescents to recite increasingly complex tongue-twisters phrases designed to trip up anyone not raised from infancy in the language. Marriage vows incorporated archaic terms even some elders struggled to define, linking couples not just to each other but to generations of unions before them. When conflicts arose, disputants were made to argue their cases using only traditional proverbs, forcing them to frame personal grievances within the community's collective wisdom. Even death rites were conducted in the oldest, most obscure variants of the language, as if ensuring the departed could still understand their descendants when meeting again in whatever world lay beyond. This linguistic heritage bred a quiet defiance in the villagers' sense of self. They weren't just a community, they were keepers of a flame others couldn't even see. While neighboring towns measured status by land or livestock, here prestige came from linguistic prowess. The elder who could recite the longest genealogical poems, the mother who composed new lullabies in perfect traditional meter, the child who spotted a borrowed word in a trader's speech. Their pride wasn't boastful but fierce, the quiet certainty of those who know they're part of something irreplaceable. When outsiders mocked their gibberish, villagers would smile and lean closer to one another, sharing some barbed aside in words that cut precisely because they couldn't be understood. The language's survival became their greatest act of resistance. Every time a parent corrected a child's grammar, they weren't just teaching speech, they were drawing a line in the sand against oblivion. Each traditional story retold, each proverb invoked at the right moment, was a refusal to let their world be swallowed by the march of time or the pressure of empires. In a single conversation between neighbors, centuries of stubborn persistence echoed the unbroken chain of voices saying, in words only they would ever fully grasp, "We are still here." And in that shared understanding, passed from lips to ears in a code no power could break, lay the true heart of what it meant to belong to the village. For centuries, the village language stood like an ancient oak, rooted deep, bending but never breaking. Yet even the sturdiest trees can falter when the winds change direction. By the late 19th century, the world beyond the valley was transforming at a dizzying pace. Roads once trodden only by occasional traders now carried steam-powered carriages rattling with goods from distant cities. Telegraph wires hummed with messages that crossed mountains in moments, not months. And with these threads of progress came an unrelenting pressure, thin as a knife's edge, prying at the seams of the village isolation. The first cracks appeared in the youngest generation. Children who once played games of linguistic deception in the square now lingered at the roadside, watching travelers with wide-eyed curiosity. A few bold teens even bartered for pamphlets or newspapers, smuggling them home to puzzle over foreign alphabets by candlelight. The elders, sensing danger, tightened their grip. Stories were told of ancestors who'd sacrificed everything to forge the language, tales of persecution, of villages burned for refusing to surrender their tongues. But where these warnings once stirred pride, some now met them with restless silence. A handful of youths began slipping away at night to nearby towns, returning with new phrases clinging to their speech like burrs. Trade, once the village's controlled interface with the outside, became a Trojan horse. Merchants no longer accepted pidgin or pantomime. They demanded contracts in the regional lingua franca. Young men who could negotiate in the common tongue found work as intermediaries, their status rising even as their fluency in the ancestral language frayed at the edges. Worse still, the outside world began offering what the village could not: schools teaching mathematics and geography, workshops humming with mechanical looms, newspapers whispering of revolutions and railroads. The language designed to protect now risked becoming a cage, one that kept its people from reaching the very future knocking at their gates. The elders' response was both ingenious and desperate. They instituted language nights, where families gathered to recite epics older than the oldest living memory. Prizes were offered for children who could compose new verses in the traditional style. A clandestine word guild formed, its members tasked with inventing modern terms, words for steam engine or telegraph, so the language could evolve without borrowing from outsiders. But the tide was hard to stem. A girl who won a regional poetry contest returned home to find her victory celebrated in hushed tones. Her poem had been in the common tongue, after all. A young man who repaired a broken mill with techniques learned in town was praised for his skill, yet his descriptions of how he'd done it were met with uneasy silence when spoken in foreign words. Perhaps the most poignant conflict played out in matters of the heart. A young woman from a neighboring valley, smitten with a village boy, begged him to teach her the secret language. He refused, bound by oath, but in doing so doomed their love. Heartbroken, he carved their story into a ballad in the ancestral tongue, its metaphors so dense that only those who knew the truth could decode its meaning. The song became wildly popular, even as its lesson haunted the village. Their language could preserve stories, but could it still create futures? Yet just as the old ways seemed destined to fade, an unexpected twist emerged. Scholars from distant universities, hearing legends of the village linguistic marvel, began arriving with recording devices and notebooks. Suddenly, the language wasn't a relic to discard, it was a treasure others envied. Teenagers who'd mocked their grandparents' backward talk now found themselves paid to recite nursery rhymes for bespectacled professors. The outside world, which had once threatened to erase the language, now offered it a strange new currency, the prestige of rarity. The elders, ever shrewd, saw an opportunity. They allowed limited study for a fee, but ensured the deepest layers of meaning remained locked away, known only to those born within the valley's embrace. In the end, the village faced a paradox familiar to all cultures clinging to uniqueness in a connected age. The very forces that endangered their language also forced them to reckon with its value. Where once the words had been a shield, now they became a banner, one that could flutter proudly in the modern wind, so long as the hands holding it refused to let go. The language would survive, but not unchanged. Like a river carving a new path through ancient stone, it would find its way, not as it was, but as it needed to be. Even the strongest fortress develops cracks over time, and for the villagers, their linguistic walls were no exception. While the secret language had united them against outsiders for generations, it began to reveal fault lines within the community itself. The elders who once stood as unanimous guardians of tradition now found themselves divided, some insisting the language must remain frozen in its purest form, while others argued it needed to evolve or risk becoming a relic. A single mispronounced word could spark heated debates at town meetings, with gray-bearded traditionalists correcting young speakers mid-sentence, their voices sharp with disapproval. The very thing that had protected their identity was becoming a battleground for its future. At the heart of these tensions lay a fundamental question: who truly owned the language? The elders claimed authority as living repositories of tradition, pointing to centuries-old ballads as proof of the correct pronunciations. Middle-aged parents, though, began whispering that their children needed practical skills beyond the valley, skills requiring fluency in outside tongues. Young couples marrying in from neighboring villages added another layer of complexity. Their imperfect grasp of the secret language created households where bedtime stories might blend two dialects, much to the horror of purists. The marketplace, once a harmonious web of coded exchanges, now occasionally erupted in arguments when a trader used what some deemed corrupted phrases to describe his wares. The schism grew deepest around education. Some families, fearing their children would be left behind in a rapidly modernizing world, secretly taught them the regional trade language first, a betrayal that traditionalists equated with cultural treason. When one father was discovered reading outside storybooks to his daughter by lantern light, the ensuing confrontation split the village for months. Reformers argued that bilingualism could be their salvation, allowing the next generation to navigate both worlds. Traditionalists countered with grim warnings. History showed how languages died when parents stopped passing them down. The unspoken fear hung heavy that they might be the last generation to truly understand the jokes in their songs, the layered meanings in their proverbs. Remarkably, the conflict birthed unexpected innovations. A faction of younger elders proposed radical compromise, preserve the core grammar and sacred words while allowing modern terms for new technologies. They devised clever linguistic grafts, taking the old word for loom and adapting it to mean sewing machine, or coining terms like iron horse for the railroad cars now visible in distant valleys. Even this measured evolution sparked outrage. Purists accused them of diluting centuries of heritage, while reformers scoffed at clinging to vocabulary that didn't include words for bank or newspaper. The debates grew so heated that some families stopped speaking to each other entirely, communicating only through terse marketplace transactions. The crisis reached its peak during the infamous Wordstorm of 1923. After months of drought, a young teacher publicly suggested praying for rain in both the village tongue and the regional language to cover all possibilities. Traditionalists saw this as blasphemy against their ancestors. That night, someone scrawled the forbidden outside words on the schoolhouse walls in charcoal. The next morning, retaliatory graffiti appeared on the homes of known reformers, written in deliberately archaic village script few could fully decipher. For 3 tense days, the community stood divided along invisible lines until the oldest living elder, a woman of 97, hobbled into the square uninvited. Without a word, she began singing the creation epic, but with subtle updates only the sharpest ears detected. Her version quietly incorporated words for train, electric light, even government tax, weaving them seamlessly into the ancient meter. The message was clear: survival required both roots and wings. In the decades that followed, the village found an uneasy balance. The secret language remained the heart of home and hearth, while schooling in outside tongues prepared children for wider opportunities. Some words were retired as the world changed. No one needed terms for ox-drawn plows anymore, while others evolved to embrace radios, bicycles, and eventually television sets. The compromises weren't perfect. Certain ballads lost their complex wordplay when updated, and jokes that had spanned generations sometimes fell flat with hybrid phrasing. But the language lived on, not as an impenetrable fortress, but as a living bridge, one that could honor the past without rejecting the future. The greatest lesson emerged slowly, that a language's strength lies not in resisting all change, but in deciding which changes are worth embracing. The slow fading of the village secret language wasn't marked by a single dramatic moment, but by 1,000 quiet losses: a child addressed in the common tongue at breakfast, a courtship conducted in borrowed words, a lullaby hummed with half-remembered lyrics. By the mid-20th century, the language that had once been an impenetrable fortress now stood like an abandoned watchtower, its walls still standing but its defenders scattered. Young people leaving for factory jobs in distant cities found their ancestral tongue as useful as a rusted key, a sentimental burden in a world demanding new vocabularies for buses, time clocks, and pay stubs. Meanwhile, those who stayed adapted out of necessity, bargaining with tourists in crisp phrases that would have made their great-grandparents wince. Economic pressures reshaped the village's linguistic landscape with brutal efficiency. Where once a farmer could trade livestock using only the secret language's intricate bartering terms, now he needed bank accounts, invoices, and agricultural manuals, all in the dominant regional tongue. Parents who'd grown up whispering warnings about outsiders now urged their children to master foreign grammar, knowing fluency meant better wages beyond the valley. Even the marketplace, that centuries-old stage for linguistic deception, transformed. Traders no longer bothered with the old pidgin. They simply switched to the common language, leaving elderly villagers straining to follow conversations that buzzed around them like unfamiliar insects. Schools became the unwitting architects of the language's decline. When a national education mandate required instruction in the official language, village children returned home correcting their parents' pronunciation. The secret tongue, once passed effortlessly from cradle to grave, now required deliberate teaching, and exhausted parents, struggling to make ends meet, often lacked the energy for nightly language lessons. A generation emerged caught between worlds. They could understand their grandparents' stories but couldn't compose their own without awkward stumbles. The language wasn't so much forgotten as fractured, its once seamless transmission now full of gaps where words used to be. Intermarriage dealt another blow. As roads improved and social barriers softened, young villagers fell for sweethearts from neighboring towns' partners who might admire the secret language's musicality but couldn't contribute to its survival. Households developed linguistic hierarchies, the old tongue reserved for scolding children or private arguments, the new language dominating daily life. One heartbroken elder described listening to her great-grandchildren play, their games peppered with foreign words like stones in a loaf of bread. "We baked it pure for centuries," she lamented, "and now they eat it full of gravel." Yet the decline wasn't entirely passive. Some elders fought back with ingenious tactics. A schoolteacher secretly wove village words into geography lessons, turning mountain names into memory aids. Midwives continued delivering babies to the rhythm of traditional birthing chants, ensuring the first sounds newborns heard belonged to the old language. A group of women compiled handwritten notebooks of recipes, not just ingredients, but the precise phrases once used to request them at market, preserving culinary terms that might otherwise vanish with their last fluent speakers. These efforts bought time, but against the tidal pull of globalization, they often felt like building sandcastles below the high tide line. By the 1970s, the language existed primarily in fragments, a curse word here, a term of endearment there, like scattered tiles from a shattered mosaic. The last fully fluent speakers, all over 80, gathered weekly at the tavern not to converse, but to perform what they called language feasts, deliberately using obscure terms to stretch their fading memories. Their conversations had the quality of archaeologists carefully brushing dust from fragile artifacts. Each recovered word a small victory. Younger villagers attended as spectators, recording the sessions on reel-to-reel tapes they barely understood, driven by a vague sense of duty rather than true comprehension. The question lingers, was this disappearance inevitable? Perhaps no language designed for exclusion could survive an interconnected age. Yet other isolated communities found compromise adopting bilingual education, digitizing oral histories, even marketing their linguistic uniqueness to tourists and scholars. The village tragedy wasn't just the loss of words, but the loss of a worldview embedded in those words. The way a rain carried echoes of a particular valley storms, how home implied not just a house but the unbroken chain of those who'd lived there. When the last elder who understood those layers passed, an entire way of thinking about time, nature, and belonging passed with her. Today, linguists study the village language through these fragments, piecing together patterns like astronomers reconstructing a dead star from its light. Its demise offers sobering lessons for the thousands of languages now teetering on extinction. Preservation requires more than nostalgia. It demands practical value, institutional support, and the flexibility to evolve. Most of all, it needs speakers who don't just remember the words, but still find reasons to say them. The villagers' language didn't fade because it failed as a code, but because the world it was designed to keep out eventually offered more than it could keep in. By the time linguists arrived with their tape recorders and notebooks, the village secret language was already breathing its last. The handful of elderly speakers left, most in their 80s or 90s, carried entire worlds inside them, their memories the final vault of a vanishing lexicon. Recording sessions became sacred rituals, held in quiet corners of the village where the hum of modern life couldn't intrude. One woman, her voice thin as parchment, sang a lullaby her great-grandmother had taught her, the melody woven with words no child had heard in decades. A bent-backed fisherman recited the names of every bend in the river, each syllable a map to fishing spots that no longer existed. These weren't just interviews, they were rescue missions, snatching fragments of a drowning culture before the tide swept them away forever. The linguists faced a race against time and against the language's own elusive nature. Without written records, every rule had to be painstakingly reconstructed from faltering memories. One elder might recall a verb conjugation perfectly, while another insisted it had always been different. Discrepancies piled up like fallen leaves, each variation a testament to how fluid the language had been in its prime. The researchers' notebooks filled with crossed-out entries and question marks, their dictionaries more like patchwork quilts than precise maps. Even the most dedicated scholars admitted defeat when it came to the language's playful subtleties, the winks and nudges embedded in proverbs, the layered meanings of seasonal ballads. You could document the words, but capturing the soul of how they'd once lived between people proved impossible. Meanwhile, a quiet revival movement took root among younger villagers. A schoolteacher herself, only semi-fluent, started afternoon classes where children learned folk songs in the old tongue. At first, the kids treated it like a game, giggling at the odd sounds. But when a visiting linguist played them a recording of their own great-grandparents speaking effortlessly in those same syllables, something shifted. The words stopped being relics and became bridges. Teenagers began peppering their slang with resurrected curses and endearments, not because they had to, but because it felt like wearing a family heirloom to a party, a way to stand out while honoring where they'd come from. Museums and universities, sensing the language's historical significance, swooped in with preservation projects. A famous institution funded the digitization of every surviving recording, while anthropologists collected artifacts tied to the language, carvings marked with secret symbols, embroidery patterned with phrases in coded stitches. One exhibit recreated the village marketplace as it might have sounded 4 generations earlier, the air thick with bartering and gossip in the secret tongue. Visitors walked through enchanted, straining to catch meanings they'd never fully grasp. Ironically, the language designed to exclude now drew crowds eager to glimpse what had been so fiercely guarded. Yet preservation came with its own ironies. The same academic papers that celebrated the language's complexity also froze it in time, turning a living, evolving thing into a specimen under glass. Folklorists argued over which version of a story was authentic, ignoring how villagers had always tweaked tales to suit new audiences. Worst of all, the outside world's fascination sometimes felt like voyeurism, like applauding a firefly's glow while ignoring the darkening habitat that threatened its extinction. Today, echoes of the language linger in unexpected places. Tourists can buy phrasebooks with greetings and folk sayings, though purists scoff that these are as shallow as postcards. A handful of families still set an extra plate at solstice feasts and whisper the old blessings, more out of ritual than belief. And in a university vault, the last native speaker's voice survives on a digital file, reciting a children's counting rhyme. The recording is flawless, but the silence after it ends, the absence of little voices chiming in, tells the real story. The language no longer thrives as it once did, but like a river that vanishes underground only to resurface miles away, it hasn't entirely disappeared. It waits, patient as always, for someone to listen closely enough to hear it breathe. History brims with languages forged in secrecy, but few match the village's linguistic fortress in scale or endurance. Take thieves' cant, the sly slang of European underworlds, a clever patchwork of code words and double meanings, but never a full-fledged language. Pickpockets might call a purse a skin, or a jail a stone jug, yet these were mere disguises slapped onto existing grammar. The village tongue, by contrast, was an entirely new ecosystem of sound, where every verb and noun grew from deliberate obscurity. Thieves' cant could be cracked with a sharp ear and a notebook. The villagers' speech defied decoding by design, its structure as enigmatic as its vocabulary. Then there's Basque, Europe's ancient linguistic mystery. Isolated for millennia, it shares no roots with neighboring tongues, standing stubbornly apart like a mountain refusing to erode. But Basque wasn't crafted to exclude, it simply survived while others faded. The village language, though, was exclusion by blueprint. Where Basque speakers welcomed converts, however clumsily, the villagers' speech actively repelled them, evolving like an immune system against outside understanding. Both are linguistic marvels, but one grew wild while the other was cultivated like a thorn hedge. Medieval guilds whispered in their own coded dialects too, especially when guarding trade secrets. Masonic lodges had signs and passwords. Silk weavers encrypted dye recipes in rhyming slang. Yet these were professional jargon, not mother tongues. A stonemason might teach his son guild codes, but at home they spoke the village dialect like everyone else. The villagers' language knew no such boundaries. It was cradle talk and deathbed whisper, love poetry and marketplace haggle, all wrapped in the same impenetrable cloak. Guild codes protected livelihoods. This language shielded an entire way of being. Even Esperanto, the idealistic, universal language invented in the 19th century, offers a fascinating inverse. Designed to connect humanity across borders, it was transparency itself, simple grammar, familiar roots. The village language was Esperanto's shadow twin, engineered not to unite but to divide. Where Esperanto's creator published dictionaries and hosted congresses, the villagers burned every scrap of writing that might explain their speech. One language flung doors open, the other barred them with every syllable. What truly sets this village apart is time. Most secret languages flicker out when their purpose fades. Thieves can't dwindle with organized beggar guilds. Wartime codes reset with each conflict. But for centuries, this village sustained its linguistic barrier without institutional power or written records. No kings enforced it, no armies patrolled its borders. It thrived simply because generation after generation chose to preserve it, adapting just enough to stay relevant without shedding its core defiance. In the end, that may be its most astonishing feat, proving that a language, no matter how carefully constructed, lives or dies by the stubbornness of the voices that carry it. The village's secret language may have faded from daily speech, but its ripples spread far beyond the valley's borders, reshaping how scholars understand the very nature of human communication. Cryptographers pored over the fragmented recordings like detectives, stunned by how effectively a spoken code could resist cracking without a single written clue. Unlike mathematical ciphers that rely on substitution patterns, this language was a living maze, its walls rearranged by each generation, its dead ends deliberately planted. Modern encryption experts still reference its principles when designing systems that evolve to outpace hackers, proving that the best codes aren't just complex but adaptive. Anthropologists found equal fascination in how the language functioned as social glue. Here was a community that had weaponized grammar to reinforce belonging, where fluency wasn't just skill but proof of allegiance. Studies of urban gangs and underground resistance movements soon drew parallels, noting how marginalized groups often develop linguistic shorthands to spot allies and repel outsiders. The village's extreme case became a textbook example of how language can carve identity as sharply as geography or genetics, offering a mirror for everything from diaspora communities to online subcultures crafting their own slang. Linguists, meanwhile, seized upon the language's structure as a rare natural experiment. Most tongues evolve organically over millennia, their origins lost to time. But this one bore the fingerprints of its creators, their choices preserved like fossils in its irregular verbs and deliberately opaque vocabulary. Researchers dissected how certain sounds were favored for confusion, how metaphors rooted in local landscapes made meanings untranslatable. Their papers reshaped academic debates about whether all languages share universal patterns, or if human ingenuity can deliberately defy them. Some argued the village had unwittingly proven that language is infinitely malleable. Others countered that even their constructed tongue revealed subconscious linguistic instincts buried deep in the mind. The legacy echoes strikingly in modern constructed languages, or conlangs. When creators of Klingon needed a guttural, warlike aesthetic for Star Trek, they studied how the villagers used harsh consonants to sound impenetrable. Dothraki's designers borrowed the principle of vocabulary reflecting cultural priorities, where the villagers had 17 words for boundary, but none for ambassador. The horse lords of Game of Thrones had endless terms for steeds, but no concept of book. Even playful conlangs like Elvish or Navi owe a debt to this real-world precedent, proving that the most believable fictional tongues borrow from humanity's own experiments in linguistic isolation. Perhaps the most profound impact lies in language preservation movements worldwide. As global tongues like English and Mandarin dominate, activists fighting to save endangered dialects cite the village story as both warning and inspiration. A language isn't just words, it's a vault of history, humor, and collective memory. Museums now employ language gardeners to nurture fading tongues, using digital tools the villagers could never have imagined. Schools in Wales, Hawaii, and the Basque Country teach immersive language nests, adapting the village's most effective tactic, making the tongue inseparable from childhood itself. Yet the story also carries sobering lessons. The village decline revealed how even the sturdiest linguistic walls crumble when they shut out more than they shelter. Modern preservationists walk a tightrope honoring tradition while allowing evolution, protecting without smothering. The villagers' language ultimately couldn't withstand the allure of roads, radios, and wages paid in outside currency. But in its defiance, it gifted the world something priceless, proof that language is more than communication. It's choice, it's resistance, and sometimes it's the last light refusing to go out. Legends have a way of growing in the dark, and the village secret language was no exception. Over the centuries, as fewer outsiders could claim to have heard it spoken, imagination rushed in to fill the silence. Travelers returning from the valley spun tales of words that could make crops wither or heal wounds with a whisper, as if the language itself held some ancient, supernatural power. One particularly persistent myth claimed that speaking certain phrases backward would summon storms, while another insisted the villagers could curse enemies by weaving their names into nursery rhymes. These stories, though fantastical, reveal something profound: how deeply the language unsettled those who couldn't penetrate it. When understanding is impossible, fear and wonder rush in to take its place. The myth of prophecy took root early. Outsiders noted how village elders would sometimes murmur cryptic phrases before droughts or floods, leading to whispers that their language could predict the future. In truth, those elders were likely reciting weather lore observations passed down through generations about cloud patterns or animal behavior, cloaked in their private tongue. But to superstitious neighbors, it seemed like sorcery. A merchant's diary from the 17th century describes a villager muttering what sounded like red wind, days before a blizzard killed a dozen sheep in a nearby town. Coincidence to the terrified shepherds, it was proof of something darker. Then there were the rumors of hidden wisdom, that the language contained lost knowledge from a golden age or secrets smuggled out of some fallen empire. Alchemists and occultists occasionally descended on the village, convinced its odd syllables held the key to eternal life or philosopher's stones. One particularly deluded nobleman even kidnapped an elderly villager, demanding he translate what he believed were alchemical recipes. The old man, thoroughly bewildered, recited bread-making instructions instead, leaving his captor to waste months boiling flour and water in search of enlightenment. The tragedy, of course, is that the language did guard profound wisdom, just not the kind outsiders imagined. Its real treasure was the quiet resilience of ordinary lives, preserved in stories and songs no alchemist would recognize as valuable. Perhaps the cruelest misconception was the belief that the language made its speakers deceitful by nature. Neighboring towns sometimes accused villagers of using their tongue to conspire, cheating at trade, plotting thefts, or mocking others to their faces. In reality, the language was less about malice than mutual protection. A mother correcting her child's grammar wasn't teaching deception. She was arming them against a world that had often shown them hostility. The villagers famed silent bargaining at markets where deals were struck with barely a word exchanged. Wasn't trickery but deep familiarity, a dance of gestures and glances honed over generations. Outsiders, misting Chinese letter for conspiracy, saw malice where there was only intimacy. Modern linguists chuckle at the wilder myths. No, the language couldn't charm snakes or turn invisible those who mastered it, but they acknowledge the kernel of truth beneath the exaggerations. A language this opaque does alter perception, not through magic but psychology. When you can't understand the conversations around you, even mundane chatter takes on an aura of significance. A baker's casual remark about the dawn might sound like a coded message if you're primed to suspect secrecy. The villagers, aware of this effect, sometimes played into it, dropping theatrical pauses or meaningful glances to keep outsiders off balance. Their language wasn't a spellbook, but it certainly knew the power of performance. The most enduring myth, though, is that the language died without a trace. Romantics imagine its last speaker taking all its secrets to the grave, leaving behind only echoes. In truth, fragments persist in the lilt of local place names, in the cadence of elders' laughter, even in the way certain families still lower their voices when sharing gossip. Languages never truly vanish. They retreat into the cracks of the world, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear them breathe. The village tongue may no longer weave its full tapestry of sound, but its threads remain, tangled in the roots of trees and the rhythms of rivers that once knew its every syllable by heart. Cultural revival often springs from the most unexpected places, like a seed carried by the wind, finding purchase in cracks no one thought could support life. Decades after the village's secret language faded from daily use, a quiet movement began among descendants scattered across cities and continents. It started with a handful of elderly recordings shared online, then grew into forums where grandchildren of villagers puzzled over phonetic spellings of words they'd only heard in bedtime stories. What began as nostalgia soon hardened into something fiercer, the determination to reclaim a birthright that had slipped through their fingers. These modern revivalists aren't trying to resurrect the language as it was. That would be impossible without the living context of the village isolation. Instead, they're reimagining it as a cultural touchstone, stitching together fragments into something both old and new. Consider the challenges they face. Unlike languages with dictionaries and grammar textbooks, this one survives in splinters, a lullaby remembered by an 80-year-old here, a marketplace phrase scrawled in a long-dead merchant's diary there. Revivalists pore over century-old linguistic notes like detectives, cross-referencing a grandmother's memory of a harvest song with a scholar's transcription of a folk tale. Discrepancies abound. One elder might recall a verb ending one way, while a historical record suggests another. These gaps force difficult choices. Do they freeze the language at the point it was last fully spoken, or allow it to evolve to fit modern needs? A heated debate erupted when a young musician coined a new word for internet by combining the old terms for spider and path. Purists arguing it betrayed the language's spirit, innovators countering that all languages grow or die. Art has become the revival's most vibrant frontier. Poets compose verses blending recovered vocabulary with contemporary themes, their meter echoing traditional patterns even as their subjects tackle climate change or migration. Visual artists embed fragments of the language in installations, neon signs humming with half-remembered proverbs, tapestries woven with phrases only visible under blacklight. Most strikingly, musicians have set surviving lyrics to new melodies, creating a haunting fusion of ancestral sounds and modern rhythms. At a festival in a nearby city last year, a folk band performed these reinvented ballads to a crowd of thousands, few of whom understood the words but all of whom felt their emotional weight. It's a far cry from the language's original purpose of exclusion, yet in its own way it still binds people together, just not by keeping others out. The revival also confronts ethical dilemmas. Some elders who remember the language's twilight years worry about its transformation into a cultural commodity. They bristle at seeing words once spoken in sacred confidence now printed on tourist coffee mugs or hashtagged in social media posts. Others argue that sharing fragments publicly is the only way to ensure any survival at all. A compromise has emerged in layered teaching. Introductory classes open to all teach basic greetings and folk songs, while advanced study groups restricted to those with proven family ties guard the deeper layers of meaning, the idioms and histories that still feel too intimate to broadcast. Even this system isn't perfect. One woman wept describing how her teenage daughter, after years of classes, could recite ceremonial poems perfectly, but would never truly grasp the childhood joy of using the language to whisper secrets under a trader's nose. What fuels this painstaking effort? For some, it's the thrill of solving a puzzle, piecing together their heritage like a linguist reconstructing a dead tongue from scattered inscriptions. For others, it's resistance against cultural homogenization, a refusal to let globalization erase every unique thread in humanity's tapestry. But for many, the motivation is deeply personal. A teacher in his 30s described finding an old tape of his great-grandmother laughing in the language, a sound he'd never heard her make in the broken common tongue she used with him as a child. It was like discovering she'd had a whole other life, he said. I wanted to meet that version of her. The revival's ultimate test may be whether the language can find a new purpose beyond nostalgia. Originally forged for survival, then worn as armor against assimilation, it's now being recast as a bridge not to the past, but to a future where identity isn't about walls but roots. Early signs suggest it's possible. A bilingual theater production last year used the language not as a barrier but as a narrative device. Scenes in the common tongue showed characters misunderstanding each other, while moments of clarity came when they switched to the ancestral speech. The message was subtle but profound, that some truths can only be spoken in the words that shaped them. Perhaps this is the language's final metamorphosis, from shield to beacon, from password to poem. It will never again function as it once did, locking out the world with every syllable, but in the mouths of great-grandchildren who'll never know the weight it once carried, it becomes something equally powerful, a choice. To speak these words now isn't an accident of birth. It's an act of love, a declaration that some connections are worth preserving even when their original necessity has faded. And in that voluntary embrace, the language invented to keep people out forever finds its most surprising fate, becoming a way to let others in. The village secret language has seeped into popular culture like a whispered rumor, morphing from historical curiosity into something closer to myth. Novelists were the first to pounce, spinning tales of star-crossed lovers separated by the linguistic barrier, or spies attempting to infiltrate the impenetrable community. One best-selling thriller portrayed the language as a living cipher, its grammar hiding clues to a lost treasure, a far cry from the mundane reality of farmers haggling over sheep prices. The irony is rich. A tongue created to repel outsiders now fuels their fantasies, its very obscurity making it irresistible to storytellers hungry for mystery. Filmmakers, too, have latched onto the village's allure, though their portrayals often prioritize drama over accuracy. A critically acclaimed foreign film depicted the language as almost musical, with villagers breaking into choreographed chants at pivotal moments, a poetic license that would have baffled the pragmatic speakers who once used it to complain about blighted crops. More egregious was a Hollywood blockbuster that turned the language into a supernatural force, suggesting certain phrases could literally bend reality. The villagers, had they seen it, might have appreciated the humor in outsiders ascribing magic to what was, at its core, an ingenious survival tactic. Music offers some of the most poignant adaptations. Folk bands weave fragments of the language into lyrics, treating it less as communication than as atmosphere, a haunting backdrop to songs about isolation and belonging. One avant-garde composer even built a symphony around the few surviving recordings, stretching and looping elders' voices until their words became pure texture. Purists argue this reduces the language to aesthetic garnish, but others counter that it's a form of preservation, ensuring those syllables aren't silenced entirely. Conspiracy theorists, predictably, have concocted wilder narratives. online forums pulse with claims that the language derives from an ancient Atlantean dialect or contains encrypted messages from extraterrestrials. Never mind that linguists have traced its roots to mundane regional influences. The internet prefers grander mysteries. A particularly persistent myth insists the Vatican maintains a secret dictionary of the language, supposedly because it encodes heretical knowledge. The truth that villagers were more concerned with hiding grain stores than cosmic secrets does little to dampen these fantasies. Perhaps the most telling portrayals come from modern villagers themselves. A recent documentary featured descendants attempting to reconstruct traditional songs, their halting pronunciation a far cry from their ancestors' fluency. The film's power lies in its honesty. These aren't mystical guardians of lost wisdom, but ordinary people grappling with fragmented heritage. Their struggles, misremembered words, debates over pronunciation highlight what popular culture often glosses over. That language isn't just about words, but the lives those words once shaped. The gap between reality and representation reveals something profound about how we engage with the unknown. The village language fascinates not because of what it was, but because of what we imagine it could be, a mirror for our own yearning for connection, secrecy, or escape. Each exaggerated retelling, no matter how inaccurate, is a backhanded tribute to the original speaker's ingenuity. They built a fortress of words, never anticipating that future generations would turn its ruins into a playground for the imagination. Lessons from the village linguistic defiance resonate with startling clarity in our hyper-connected world, where languages vanish at the rate of one every 2 weeks. Their story holds up a mirror to modern tensions between cultural preservation and global homogenization, revealing how language isn't just about words, it's about sovereignty over one's own narrative. Consider the parallels. Today's indigenous communities from the Amazon to the Arctic deploy language revitalization programs as acts of resistance, much like the villagers' deliberate linguistic isolation. The difference lies in strategy. Where the medieval villagers built walls, contemporary movements construct bridges, using technology to preserve uniqueness without sacrificing connection. Apps now teach Cherokee to toddlers, while YouTube channels broadcast Ainu folktales globally, proving that survival no longer demands isolation. The village experience also exposes the double-edged nature of linguistic barriers. Their language fostered unparalleled unity internally while breeding distrust externally, a dynamic playing out in modern debates over minority language rights. In Wales, road signs in Welsh and English spark pride for some, resentment for others. In Quebec, francophone laws preserve culture but sometimes strain anglophone relations. The villagers' extreme approach demonstrates what happens when defense turns to defiance, protection becomes prison. Yet their eventual decline offers a cautionary tale about rigidity. Like biodiversity, linguistic diversity thrives through adaptation, not stasis. The Maori language's resurgence in New Zealand exemplifies this balance. Immersive language nests for preschoolers coexist with Maori language rap songs and tech startups, proving tradition can ride the waves of change rather than drown beneath them. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in language's power to shape thought itself. The villagers didn't just speak differently, they perceived differently. Their world view encoded in untranslatable phrases for boundary marking or weather patterns. Modern neuroscience confirms what their experience hinted. Language influences cognition. Russian speakers distinguish shades of blue more sharply thanks to separate words for light and dark blue. The Gugu Yimithirr people of Australia navigate by cardinal directions rather than egocentric terms, their speech reflecting and reinforcing an exceptional spatial awareness. When languages vanish, we don't just lose vocabulary, we lose alternate ways of structuring reality. The villagers understood this instinctively, guarding their linguistic lens as fiercely as their grain stores. Globalization amplifies these stakes. English dominates academia and the internet not through malice but momentum, creating what linguists call transactional languages for convenience. Yet convenience has costs. When a Philippine student learns calculus in English but lacks terms for ancestral farming techniques in their native Tagalog, both knowledge systems suffer. The villager's story forces us to ask, how do we build towers of Babel that don't crush the terraces beneath them? Some answers emerge from unexpected places: Iceland's rigorous coinage of new tech terms in Icelandic, or Finland's policy of subtitling rather than dubbing foreign media to protect linguistic ecosystems while engaging globally. Technology, often blamed for linguistic erosion, now fuels revival. AI tools analyze the last recordings of Ayak, an Alaskan language with one living speaker, generating pronunciation guides for new learners. Blockchain projects in Norway archive Sami languages in decentralized networks, making them censorship-resistant. These innovations mirror the villagers' ingenuity but invert their intent, using openness as preservation. The lesson isn't that secrecy failed, but that modern solutions must balance protection with participation. A language locked away like a relic dies. One planted in the wilds of the digital age might just take root. Ultimately, the village legacy isn't a blueprint but a provocation. Their experiment proves language can be both shield and sanctuary, yet their decline warns against mistaking walls for foundations. In an era where Google Translate handles 133 languages but 3,000 others teeter on extinction, their story asks us, what are we willing to sacrifice for understanding, and what must we never surrender to belong? The answer, like their language, lies somewhere between what we keep close and what we dare to share. Ethical lines blur when we examine the village's linguistic fortress through modern eyes. On one hand, their secret language stands as a triumph of cultural self-determination, a community carving out sovereignty through syllables when political autonomy was impossible. Imagine a people stripped of land or power, yet fashioning an invisible border no army could breach. In an era where dominant cultures routinely erased minority identities, their linguistic resistance feels heroic, a quiet rebellion against assimilation. Yet peel back another layer, and uncomfortable questions emerge. Did this linguistic isolation cross into xenophobia? When children were taught to feign ignorance rather than share words with outsiders, were they learning preservation or prejudice? The villagers' own stories hint at this tension. Folktales celebrated tricksters who deceived travelers, while elders warned that even a single borrowed word could unravel generations of secrecy. Their language wasn't just a shield, it demanded suspicion as its price. Modern linguists remain divided. Preservationists argue that languages like this are irreplaceable vaults of human ingenuity, living libraries of metaphor, humor, and worldview. They point to the villagers' intricate oral histories, where every proverb was a time capsule of survival strategies and ecological wisdom. Losing such a language, they insist, isn't just losing words, it's burning a unique lens through which humans understood existence. Yet critics counter that glorifying isolationist practices risks romanticizing insularity. A language designed to obstruct communication sits uneasily in an interconnected world where dialogue across cultures solves crises from climate change to pandemics. The villagers might have safeguarded traditions, but at what cost? Their resistance to outside ideas meant missing agricultural innovations that could have eased famines, or medical knowledge that might have saved children. The debate grows thornier when applied to contemporary examples. Consider modern parallels like corporate jargon designed to obscure layoffs or political euphemisms that mask injustice. Are these not secret languages of a sort, weaponizing exclusivity to maintain power? Conversely, indigenous communities today fighting to revive nearly erased tongues argue their efforts are acts of justice reclaiming what colonialism sought to destroy. The village language straddles both camps, simultaneously a tool of resistance and a barrier to progress. Perhaps the sharpest ethical dilemma lies in preservation itself. When scholars recorded the language's last speakers, they faced a paradox. Documenting it required violating its foundational principle of secrecy. Some elders refused to participate, taking idioms to their graves as their ancestors intended. Others consented, hoping fragments might survive even if the walls fell. This tension echoes in archives worldwide, where marginalized communities must decide whether sharing cultural patrimony with outsiders safeguards it or surrenders its essence. Balance emerges in unexpected places. Descendants of the village now navigate this tightrope, teaching the language in modified forms, not as a cipher to exclude, but as a heritage to celebrate. Their compromise acknowledges a hard truth. Purity preserved behind walls becomes a museum piece, while languages that adapt risk losing what made them singular. The villagers' greatest legacy might be this very lesson, that survival sometimes requires redefining what it means to belong. Archaeologists searching for physical traces of the village's secret language face a paradox. The very feature that made it so resilient in life makes it nearly invisible in death. Unlike ancient civilizations that carved their histories into stone or pressed stylus to clay, these villagers built their linguistic fortress on breath and memory. Deliberate avoidance of written records was their first line of defense. Why commit words to parchment when fire or theft could betray them? Yet this precaution leaves modern researchers piecing together clues from oblique sources. A pottery shard with peculiar markings, a doorframe carved with symbols that resist translation, or the faint etchings on tools that might be owner's marks or something far more nuanced. The most tantalizing discoveries come from rare artifacts that hint at coded communication without revealing its rules. A set of 18th century weaving tools, for instance, bears notches arranged in groups of 3 and 5, a tally system, perhaps, or something more complex when viewed through the lens of the language's structure. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered a child's toy, a wooden horse with syllables carved into its belly, likely used to teach the secret tongue through play. These fragments suggest the language wasn't just spoken but embedded into daily objects, turning mundane items into subtle teaching tools. Oral histories provide another layer of evidence, albeit filtered through generations of retelling. Elders in neighboring villages recount tales of mysterious, silent markets, where goods changed hands without audible negotiation, hinting at sophisticated nonverbal extensions of the language, perhaps gestures or object placements that carried specific meanings. One folktale describes a traveling minstrel who attempted to transcribe the language by mimicking bird calls, only to be met with laughter from villagers who recognized the ruse. Such stories, while not physical evidence, sketch the boundaries of what researchers are up against, a system designed to defy documentation. The absence of written records isn't absolute, though. A handful of contested artifacts tease the possibility of deliberate misdirection. A ledger from a nearby monastery references a Book of the Valley people, seized and burned in the 15th century for containing marks of devilish craft. Was this a rare attempt to transcribe the language, or merely an outsider's fearful misinterpretation of mundane notes? Similarly, 19th century ethnographers collected vocabulary lists, later proven to be elaborate hoaxes, words villagers invented to satisfy prying scholars. These false trails reveal as much about the language's guardians as any genuine relic might. Their commitment to secrecy didn't waver even under pressure. Modern technology offers new hope. Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalies beneath the village square, possibly hidden chambers where elders gathered to discuss linguistic evolutions away from prying ears. Spectral imaging of aged parchment fragments recovered from a midden heap reveals faint traces of ink that may be faded word lists or ritual texts. Most promising are advances in audio archaeology. Researchers are applying AI pattern recognition to early wax cylinder recordings of elder speakers, isolating phonetic structures that could reconstruct grammatical rules lost to time. Yet the gaps in understanding remain vast. Without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, a bilingual text bridging the secret language and a known tongue, many discoveries remain speculative. The language's fluidity compounds the challenge. Words that meant one thing in 1800 might have shifted entirely by 1850. Even if every surviving artifact could be decoded, they'd represent mere snapshots of a living, shifting system. What emerges from these fragments is a portrait of a language that thrived precisely because it left so little behind. Its power lay in its ephemerality, in the space between one breath and the next, in the collective memory of people who chose invisibility over immortality. The villagers understood something modern archivists are only beginning to grapple with, that some forms of knowledge aren't meant to be preserved under glass, but carried forward in the quiet certainty of voices that refuse to be silenced. Languages are never truly isolated, no matter how fiercely their speakers guard them. Like water seeping through cracks, fragments of the village's secret speech trickled into neighboring dialects, leaving traces as faint yet persistent as ink bleeding through old parchment. While the villagers policed their linguistic borders with vigilance, centuries of unavoidable contact, trade marriages, seasonal labor, even the occasional friendship allowed slivers of their tongue to escape into the wild. Today, linguists hunt these echoes like detectives reconstructing a ghost from footprints, piecing together clues hidden in the speech of surrounding communities long after the original language faded. Take something as mundane as place names. The valley's geography is dotted with terms that resist translation in any known regional language. A rocky outcrop known locally as Vorat's Cradle bears a prefix that appears nowhere else in the region's toponyms, yet matches the village term for hidden. Similarly, a ford along the trade route called Shylands Crossing incorporates what linguists believe is a corrupted form of the villagers' word for whisper. These aren't coincidences, they're linguistic fossils, preserved precisely because place names often outlive the tongues that coined them. Like stubborn weeds, they took root in outsiders' vocabularies despite efforts to keep the language contained. More intriguing are the grammatical oddities that ripple through nearby dialects. A cluster of hamlets northeast of the valley still use an unusual verb construction when discussing secrets or private matters, a reflexive form that literally translates to "I say to myself" rather than "I say." This matches fragmentary records of the villagers' habit of altering verb moods when discussing sensitive topics. Even more telling is a regional nursery rhyme about a talking crow, where the bird's dialogue follows a distinct stress pattern that mirrors the secret language's rhythmic codes. Children chanting it for generations had no idea they were preserving a linguistic relic, much like English speakers unknowingly recite Norse poetry remnants in jump rope rhymes. Trade jargon offers another vein of influence. Certain crafts, wool dyeing, barrel making, developed specialized terms in the region that baffle etymologists. A particular shade of blue pigment was called heshka, a word with no Latin or Germanic roots, yet strikingly similar to the villagers' term for sky at dusk, recovered from an elder's recording. Barrel makers referred to a specific wood joining technique as rilgan, a phrase that aligns with the village construction terms meaning to lock away. These weren't borrowings in the traditional sense. They were linguistic contraband, smuggled out through years of side-by-side labor and repurposed for practical use. The most compelling evidence, though, lies in what neighboring languages lack. Linguists note curious gaps in regional dialects concepts that seem to demand words but remain stubbornly unlabeled. There's no historic term for eavesdropping in the valley's trade pidgin, only clumsy circumlocutions like hearing what isn't yours. Tellingly, the villagers' language had 7 distinct words for the act, each specifying context and intent. This absence suggests not just linguistic influence, but adaptive resistance, neighbors avoiding certain expressions because they too closely resembled the secret tongue, much like skipping a musical note that feels off-key. Perhaps the most poignant survivals are the unintentional ones. A folk remedy for sore throats in a nearby town involves whispering herbs' names 3 times before brewing, a practice with no clear medicinal basis, but one that mirrors the villagers' belief in words' hidden power. An old shepherding call in the mountains uses a melodic interval that matches the secret language's tonal patterns for safe passage. These aren't direct borrowings, but cultural impressions, like shadows cast by a language that refused to be forgotten. Deciphering these fragments is painstaking work. Linguists must separate genuine influence from coincidence, like distinguishing a faded fresco from random stains on ancient walls. A single verified loanword might require comparing century-old merchant ledgers, folklore collections, and the rare village artifact. Yet each recovered shard adds depth to our understanding of how languages, no matter how guarded, leave fingerprints on the world. The villagers built walls of words, but their legacy lingers in the cracks between stones whispers carried farther than they ever intended. For Maria Kovac, growing up in the shadow of the lost language meant stolen moments of magic. Her grandmother would wait until the bakery's ovens cooled each evening, then pull her onto her lap and murmur phrases like Larash Neldom, words Maria later learned meant little moon, a pet name preserved across generations. She'd say it while braiding my hair, Maria recalls, as if those syllables could weave the old world into the new. But the lessons came with warnings: never speak them at school, never repeat them to the census takers who came asking about regional dialects. The language lived in whispers, a forbidden lullaby passed between those who still remembered its weight. Not all memories are tender. In the Petrovic family, the old tongue became a source of quiet rebellion. Young Luca discovered his grandfather's notebook filled with strange words tucked under a floorboard, only to have his father burn it upon finding him studying the pages. He said it was dead weight, Luca explains, rubbing the scar where an ember singed his wrist, that we needed to focus on Serbian or German if we wanted jobs beyond the valley. The incident sparked a decades-long silence between father and son, one that only lifted when Luca's own child began asking about the notebook's contents. In these households, the language wasn't just fading, it was being deliberately dismantled, brick by linguistic brick. The duality of the language's legacy emerges vividly in courtship stories. Elderly Jovan describes courting his wife in the 1950s by sneaking her phrases he'd pieced together from market eavesdropping. I'd say vesht merul, you glow, and watch her cheeks turn the color of apricots. Their entire relationship unfolded in this stolen vocabulary, a private rebellion against parents who saw the old words as backwards. Yet 2 valleys over, Anna recounts how her mother rejected a suitor solely because he couldn't pronounce the mourning rites properly. "A man who can't grieve in the true tongue can't love in it either," she declared, leaving honor to wonder if linguistic purity had cost her a happier match. Some of the most poignant testimonies come from those who caught only fragments. Milna, now in her 70s, mimics the cadence of her great-aunt's curses, rich, guttural things that made chickens scatter. "I haven't a clue what most meant," she laughs, "but Lord, they sounded magnificent." Others inherited single phrases stripped of context, a blessing before meals, a rhyme for warding off nightmares, or in one bittersweet case, the exact wording for "I'm sorry," as spoken by a grandfather on his deathbed. These linguistic shards function like heirloom china, too precious to use, too fragmented to serve their original purpose, yet impossible to discard. The stories take darker turns when recalling the language's final fluent generation. Dragon recounts his uncle's last years when dementia unspooled his mind back to childhood, and with it, returned his mastery of the secret tongue. After decades of refusing to speak it, suddenly he'd lecture empty chairs in words none of us understood, Dragon murmurs. Nurses assumed it was gibberish until a visiting linguist recognized the patterns. In those final months, the old man held conversations with long-dead siblings, laughed at jokes only he could decipher, and died mid-sentence, leaving behind a mystery neither family nor scholars could unravel. What threads connect these fractured memories? Beyond nostalgia or stubborn traditionalism, the language represented something far deeper: autonomy. In kitchens and barns, grandparents used it to critique communist policies without fear of informers. Parents whispered it during children's illnesses, as if ancient words held healing power modern medicine lacked. Teenagers tested its curse words like forbidden weapons, thrilled by the shock on elders' faces. Each generation reinvented its purpose, from survival tool to cultural heirloom to rebellious act, but the through line remained. These syllables were theirs in a world that kept demanding they speak differently. The descendants' voices reveal a fundamental truth about language's power. It wasn't the vocabulary itself that mattered most, but what speaking it represented. A choice to remember when forgetting was easier, to belong to something the world couldn't categorize. When Marija describes teaching her toddler the old lullaby her grandmother once sang, she isn't just preserving sounds, she's passing down the unbroken thread of defiance woven into every syllable. She'll never need it like they did, Marija admits, rocking her sleeping daughter, but she'll know it existed, that we were here. In that quiet certainty, the language's true purpose endures. The digital age has transformed secrecy into an arms race, algorithms pitted against algorithms, encryption keys swapped like whispered passwords across sprawling networks. Yet the villager's ancient strategy offers a surprising counterpoint. What if true privacy lies not in complex codes, but in reshaping language itself? Modern encrypted apps create temporary fortresses around messages, but the village built an entire linguistic landscape where every conversation was its own cipher. Their approach reveals a radical truth: the most enduring barriers aren't imposed by technology, but cultivated through culture. Consider how online subcultures unconsciously mirror the village tactics. Gaming clans develop slang that baffles outsiders. Financial traders speak in acronym-laden shorthand. Even TikTok trends spawn inside jokes that scroll past uncomprehending parents. These aren't just casual dialects, they're social moats, designed to separate those who belong from those who don't. The villagers would recognize this instinct immediately. Their genius was recognizing that language isn't just a tool for connection, but for curation, a way to filter the world long before algorithms decided who sees what. Encryption experts are now probing the village's methods for fresh inspiration. Traditional cybersecurity focuses on mathematical complexity, but human behavior remains its weakest link. Phishing scams trick users into surrendering passwords. Social engineering bypasses firewalls through persuasion. The villagers anticipated this vulnerability centuries ago. Their system didn't rely on perfect secrecy, but on perfect skepticism. Children learned early that outsiders' questions were traps to avoid, not puzzles to solve. Modern security protocols might benefit from this cultural layer, teaching users not just how to create strong passwords, but how to develop an ingrained wariness of unfamiliar linguistic patterns. Yet the village legacy also warns of unintended consequences. Their isolation preserved traditions but stifled innovation. Their linguistic walls kept threats out, yet also barred new ideas from entering. Today's encrypted platforms face similar dilemmas. Privacy advocates celebrate Signal and Proton Mail for shielding dissenters from surveillance, yet those same tools can harbor harmful conspiracy theories or criminal networks. The villagers discovered too late that exclusionary systems often trap their creators as much as their targets. Any modern application of their strategies must grapple with this duality. Secrecy empowers, but it also isolates. Perhaps the most provocative lesson lies in the villagers' understanding of language as living armor. They didn't just invent words, they engineered an entire ecosystem where speech adapted to threats in real time. This fluidity outpaced any static cipher. In an era where AI cracks passwords in milliseconds, their model suggests a tantalizing alternative: communication that evolves faster than decryption algorithms can chase it. Imagine messaging apps where slang mutates hourly, or corporate jargon designed to baffle industrial spies. The villagers proved language could be a moving target, a concept that might just redefine digital security. The future of linguistic secrecy won't involve abandoning technology, but layering it with human ingenuity. The villagers' descendants, now scattered across continents, offer an unexpected blueprint. Some teach fragments of the old tongue in online forums, not for utility but as cultural resistance. Others work in Silicon Valley, applying ancestral principles to firewall design. Their story reminds us that privacy isn't just about hiding information, it's about controlling who gets to shape its meaning. In a world drowning in data but starving for trust, that distinction may be the most valuable cipher of all. The village secret language was never just a collection of words. It was a living act of defiance, a declaration that some bonds are too sacred to be translated. Think about the sheer audacity it took to construct an entire linguistic universe from scratch, not to connect with the wider world, but to keep it at arm's length. This wasn't mere communication, it was architecture, with every syllable a brick in walls no army could breach. For generations, it did more than preserve traditions. It became the very heartbeat of a community, pulsing through lullabies, market banter, and the quiet conversations that shaped their collective fate. What's most striking isn't that the language existed, but how perfectly it served its purpose. Like a suit of armor forged from sound, it turned everyday speech into both shield and weapon. Outsiders might hear a farmer discussing the weather, but beneath the surface flowed warnings, jokes, and plans entirely invisible to uninitiated ears. The brilliance lay in its adaptability: verbs that twisted like vines to confuse eavesdroppers, proverbs that doubled as historical records, even children's games that secretly drilled linguistic vigilance. This wasn't static code, it was a living system, evolving just enough with each generation to stay one step ahead of curiosity or conquest. Yet languages, like the people who speak them, can't exist in suspended animation forever. The village story forces us to confront a painful truth: that survival sometimes demands sacrifice. Their linguistic fortress kept them safe, yes, but also isolated them from the very alliances that might have ensured their future. Like a tree growing in a walled garden, their culture thrived in controlled conditions until the world outside changed too drastically to ignore. Roads brought not just traders but textbooks. Radios crackled with songs in foreign tongues. Young people glimpsed futures where their ancestral words held no currency. The language that had been their strength became, in time, their shackles. But let's not mistake fading for failure. The villagers' legacy isn't measured in how long their secret tongue endured, but in what it proved possible. In an era of empires and enforced assimilation, they carved out sovereignty through sheer linguistic ingenuity. Their story whispers to marginalized communities everywhere that resistance doesn't always require swords or slogans. Sometimes it's woven into the very fabric of speech. Today, as languages vanish at alarming rates, their example takes on new urgency. From the Ainu of Japan to the Warlpiri of Australia, indigenous groups fighting to revive ancestral tongues draw strength from knowing isolation isn't the only path. Technology now offers tools the villagers never imagined: apps that teach near-extinct vocabularies, AI that reconstructs lost pronunciations. But the core challenge remains the same: how to honor the past without becoming its prisoner. As we navigate our own era of globalized communication, the villagers' choices invite reflection. Every language we use, whether a mother tongue, a learned dialect, or even the coded slang of online spaces, shapes how we see the world and who we let into ours. Their story asks us, what are we protecting with our words? What might we be walling out? And when does the fortress we build around ourselves become the thing that stifles us? There's poetry in how their language, designed to exclude, now draws scholars and storytellers eager to uncover its secrets. What was once a barrier has become, centuries later, a bridge connecting us to a way of thinking that might otherwise have slipped away unheard. So while the village secret tongue may no longer echo through the valley as it once did, its echoes linger in unexpected places, in the determination of modern language revivalists, in the encrypted codes of digital activists, even in the private family phrases we invent to keep certain moments sacred. The villagers' greatest lesson wasn't about secrecy, it was about the power of human creativity to forge connection on its own terms. Their words may have faded, but the choice they represent endures, that how we speak is never just about communication, but about who we are, who we trust, and what we're willing to defend. And in a world where languages continue to disappear at the rate of one every 2 weeks, that choice feels more vital than